I'm Emily, in my third year of doing my PhD, and I'm in the history department at the University of Liverpool. Don't ask me how it's going. So my PhD research uses what is called an oral history methodology, and this methodology has changed a lot in recent years, and I just kind of wanted to discuss the ways in which it might further change in the future. So my research tries to understand the emotional and psychological impact of nuclear weapons in Britain during the Cold War, and it is informed mostly through oral history interviews. So I talk to a lot of people and I record them and transcribe them and analyse them and so on. And there's a kind of little quote in my title here by one of my interviewees: "You've got so much more media now on your iPhone, on your Facebook, you know." Kind of really made me reflect on what the future might hold for research methodologies like my own. So as I said, my methodology is an oral history project, so I chat to people about their life histories and I ask about the Cold War. So I think a lot about ideas around composure and emotions and memory, but this method, as I said, has changed so much in recent years due to changes in the legalities and ethics of doing a project like this, but also because of the development of things like Facebook and the internet, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about a little bit. So I'm going to briefly talk to you today about a number of different ideas and considerations when thinking about the future of oral history. And in my case, I'm going to talk about it specifically when trying to understand the Cold War. So I'll consider how modern technological developments such as the internet, social media, and video gaming, so virtual reality in particular, and thinking about how these things will and have changed, how we understand and consider the past when listening to people and their memories. In 2018, we're now more concerned with our privacies, and of course, the new Data Protection Act came in recently, and this has and could both hinder and advance the future of oral history. Furthermore, when looking at something like the Cold War, these issues and considerations become even more important as it is within our remembered past. And the Cold War is something that is quite commonly in our popular discourse at the moment, with things like North Korea and Donald Trump and kind of nuclear weapons appearing in the media again. A lot of people and historians are kind of reflecting back to the Cold War to kind of understand why these things are going on today. So many people who lived through the Cold War now also use many of these new technologies, which I'll talk about, and these have altered and shifted their memory recall and the ways in which they present information and knowledge in an oral history interview. So I'll be considering what technologies should we consider when utilising oral history as a methodology, what is the future of oral history in 2018, and how can we understand perceptions and memories of the British Cold War in the present day, and what digital cultures have influenced these. So what is oral history? So oral history broadly concerns the remembered past, so usually of the recent past, so within the lifetime of the individual, of a community or an individual, and it is expressed verbally. It is often acquired through recorded interviews between a historian and a participant, or plural, and is later transcribed. Its interests lie with the processes of remembering the past and composing that past into a spoken narrative around the historical interests of the historian. Much of history is passed down to other generations through written accounts, such as letters or diaries, and is used in historical research. And while such sources are valuable, they often leave out details and perspectives that would be of interest to a researcher and the public. So oral history is quite unique in being able to not only examine the past, but the ways in which the past and the present self are constructed in relation to one another. So for example, thinking about my own research, some participants construct their Cold War memories using their experiences from World War II, but they also use their current present self to inform this construction as well. So here, for example, this interaction with Cheryl Lincoln, one of my interviewees, she says, "It's funny, I was watching the snooker on here and there's a man playing. He was very good and his name is, oh, I've forgotten. Oh yes, his name was Kim Jong-young but I can't remember, I'm getting the two of them mixed up." And then I asked, "Oh, and that made you think of nuclear war?" And she said, yes it does. It makes you think about it. Anything makes you think about it. Anytime you hear anything, you think, oh God, not another war, please. But things like rationing, that wouldn't bother me. We've coped with that. But having seen the damage on television and that, seeing the damage of what the bombs did on Hiroshima and that, you know, there's no hiding from it, is there? The shelters wouldn't do any good. So she talks about when she watched the snooker, that reminded her of nuclear war because of today's current international tensions with North Korea and Donald Trump, like I just said. So here she's using her present day kind of self or recent memories to inform how she felt about the Cold War. And then at the end, she talks about rationing and then references her experiences of the Second World War. So she's constructing her Cold War self through her past and present experiences and then narrating that self and those stories to me. So memory is another thing that I'm interested in. So memory is a universal human quality whereby individuals are able to recall or retrieve an experience in the past. Within oral history, these memories are evoked during interviews and later analysed. Memory draws its disciplinary framework from psychology, social psychology, and the humanities more broadly, developing into a number of different subfields, including things like collective memory, official memory, national memory, and of course, individual memories. Memory and the process of recalling can offer new perspectives, interpretations, and impressions of the past, and understandings of the meanings of what and how the past is remembered. Memory is what primarily the data for an oral history interview relies on, and so when these new technologies are developed which allow us to store memories or to create new ones, this may change the ways in which people discuss oral history or past events. It may mean that people remember things that didn't happen or have a more accurate memory, and it may mean new challenges for oral historians in the future. How will we deal with an already complex concept such as memory when we must consider perhaps the existence or creation of virtual memories or external memories? Memory is then what we'll be considering predominantly in this presentation, as many new technologies have been developed in recent years which may change or alter our memory recall processes and thus the content of oral history interviews. So, Facebook, social media, how might that change memory or oral history? So firstly and most obviously, oral historians now have a new way of contacting individuals and accessing people who perhaps we couldn't have accessed previously. Through the internet and social media, we are now able to communicate quickly and find people effectively. For example, when finding people to interview for my own project, I sought out Facebook groups such as local history groups or veteran groups and anti-nuclear communities, and I was able to access these groups because of the existence of the internet. Just as oral historian Alistair Thompson predicted, through new technologies and the internet, we're able to connect and find interviewees easier than ever. Snowball sampling is often used in studies like these, and Facebook and other social medias improve the efficiency in this. However, that isn't to say that these mediums are only a good thing. Contacting people through social media and kind of seeing their personal data, and obviously these are private social media accounts, isn't perhaps the most ethical way. And most ethic regulation bodies don't really have that much regarding how to protect participants through social media and the internet. So that's kind of a new challenge that's appearing in recent years. And furthermore, participants are usually less likely to meet with you if you contacted them online through Facebook or social media than if you contacted them through an email or through word of mouth or through an advertisement. Another interesting thing that came up within my interviews is what I call fact-checking. So often participants during memory recall, they struggle to remember a particular aspect of that memory. So they have that tip of the tongue experience, you know, when you're like, oh, I can't quite remember the name of that thing, and it's really annoying because it feels like you can't move forwards with the story unless you remember the name of that thing. But now with the internet, quite often participants will use their phones during an interview to Google or find the name of the thing they can't remember, or they message their friends or their family to be like, oh, do you remember when this happened? Can you remind me how that went, basically? So in this way, participants are using what I would call an external memory. So they don't store it in their brains. Instead, it's on their phone or their laptop or on the internet. So the place or the name of the details of that particular memory might not have felt important enough to store in their long-term memory. Instead, they're not able to naturally recall it and use technological means to remember. So, for example, I might ask them something about the Berlin Wall, and instead of kind of locating, like when the Berlin Wall fell, instead of locating this in their own time scale or within their own lives, they Google it and say, oh yes, it was 1989, and then this happened. So it could be a good thing, and this helps memory, but it also interrupts what I would call natural memory recall, which is often quite interesting and an important part of oral history research. And this, of course, is a fairly new phenomenon in the last 30 years. And so considering how technology might influence memory is quite important for future oral historians. Also, with online as well, so when you're kind of recording these interviews and then you transcribe them and then you just put the quote or the transcription in your thesis or in your journal or in your book, it's kind of hard to to kind of hear the emotions or like how that conversation kind of went down, like how that interaction went. But with the development of new technology, there might be ways that we can kind of integrate those sound bites, particularly in online journals or when we have like ebooks and things. So rather than just reading the transcription and kind of maybe just agreeing with what whoever's written about it has said, we'll be able to listen back to it and be like, okay, I can hear how that person was sad, or I can hear how that person was thinking, and I can hear all the pauses and the way in which they're kind of going through that recall. So VR, or virtual reality, is another thing which I find quite interesting, which might change how we assess memory and how we recall memory and the types of memories that we recall. So in the past few years, virtual reality technology has become exceedingly popular. So virtual reality, a technology previously only for people with a lot of money, has become an accessible household gimmick, with companies selling cardboard VR-like kits for as little as £7 on Amazon. In 2017, PlayStation VR, which is on there, sold 1.7 million units alone, and the market for VR headsets is estimated to reach 37 million units overall by 2020. Subsequently, numerous games and experiences have appeared, allowing users to explore and experience places, stories, and worlds in new, immersive ways. So, for example, we can now go to virtual spaces and places that might not exist, but we can also visit places that do exist. So there are virtual tours of like the Eiffel Tower, for example, that you can now do in virtual reality. So what does that mean for an oral historian? Well, firstly, it might mean that future participants who visit these virtual spaces and have memories of these spaces, these memories have no physicality. So, for example, a participant may go on a virtual tour of Berlin and discuss Berlin as if they actually visited there, and they might not even mention it was a virtual tour, when in actual fact that memory was entirely virtual and they weren't physically there. And so the historian must unpick these physical and virtual layers to understand the truth and the meaning behind that memory. So this idea of virtual memory isn't even as far-fetched as it seems either. Many interviewees recall memories that aren't actually theirs. So inherited memory is quite a big thing that we have to deal with in oral history. So you all remember stories of when you were a kid, right? But you don't actually remember that happening. You remember it because your mum and dad or whoever told you that happened to you, so you remember it. But what you're remembering is another memory of somebody else that has been passed to you. And then you also have things like collective memories of a community, and traumatic events often kind of become integrated into a collective memory. And people often also recall like official memories. So for example, when I interview people about their memories of the Cold War, they often use information and memories they have from documentaries or books that they've read and watched. And this official information informs how they structure their own personal memories. So one person I interviewed talked loads about how they recently watched a documentary about a nuclear bunker, and then they used that information as a way in to talk about their actual remembered childhood. So it's a very, very real possibility that historians will have to decode not only the ways in which the past and the present informs each other, but also how our physical and digital selves inform one another. And this is actually particularly interesting when we consider the influence of VR technology on the Cold War and its remembered history. So this is an experience called the Chernobyl Vr Project, which came out in 2016. And this allows the player to go on a virtual tour of the Chernobyl nuclear accident site, filmed as it was in 2015, I think all the filming went on. And obviously very few people are actually permitted or can get into that exclusion zone in the present day. So in this way, through virtual reality, people are able to visit a historically important site that's inaccessible to the everyday person, as if they were actually there, and experience the emotional immersion of the location. So people may remember visiting Chernobyl in a virtual sense rather than a physical one. And so if so, historians need to come up with new methodologies and research practices to better understand how this works and how to interpret these memories. So moving on a little bit, this is perhaps a more immediate factor which might change how oral history works and the relationship between interviewers and interviewees. So in 2018, the issue of data protection has become increasingly important and has literally already changed the way we must protect the confidentiality of our interviewees in the present. But what about those who are also in the past? So in 2018, the British government passed a new Data Protection Act under the General Data Protection Regulation, and this bill seeks to empower individuals to take control of their personal data and to support organisations with their lawful processing of personal data. Although the legislation is still undergoing development, archives, for example, which contain vast amounts of personal and private data of those both living and dead, must now consider the future and the ways in which the archive might change under this new act. And this applies to oral history and wider history as well. So if personal data is being retained in these public archives or placed online, this removes the increased power over data that individuals have been promised through this act. So for example, many people may have had their personal information, like their names or their family members or their opinions, placed in a newspaper before the popularity of the internet, and they might have consented when it was published. So, maybe in an interview in the 1980s, they're like, yeah, that's fine, the local newspaper can publish that, I don't mind. But how could that person fathom how that information would be used now with the internet, and that information is so accessible? Like, they haven't signed anything else necessarily, but that information is readily available and accessible to people. And this is true of interviews as well. So like much older oral history interviews and recordings where people kind of signed and they're like, yes, that's fine. And then, when these interviews kind of get put online, like how could they imagine how their data would be used, and like how can we regulate it and make sure it's confidential and safe for the person in question? And this is perhaps more important, these interviews, because many people have shared their personal stories and private moments with historians, and these are now readily accessible in a lot of cases to the public. And so archives and the oral historians creating the data must rethink how we collect and store oral history interviews. We must allow participants control of their data, and most importantly, we shouldn't fear participants having control of their own data. Oral historians have to rethink how to ethically collect information, how we allow participants control over their data, and consider the storage of such recorded interviews in archives. Under this new act alone, oral history must make quick decisions on modernising the methodology to ensure the ethical future of the practice. Furthermore, we need to rethink how we can ensure the data protection of those who've already signed ethics forms and already had their voices into archival storage or online. How can we ensure that they have increased control of their personal data? And finally, I just wanted to quickly mention privacy. So in 2018, concerns over privacy is another huge issue. We see it all the time, like online hacks, data mining, people's information being stolen. So in an age where online hacks are common news stories and people are becoming increasingly worried about the protection of their own privacy, oral historians have to respond to this as well. So we need to consider how we can restructure our methodologies to ensure it's safe and ethical and provides protection to our interviewees, without whom our research wouldn't even be possible. So just to conclude, this presentation has argued that when we conduct and use oral history interviews, historians must consider the channels of knowledge that exist in the 21st century and the ways in which these inform and influence the interview. Through Google, participants can fact-check themselves. Through virtual reality, participants are able to visit places and experience the Cold War even though they weren't physically present. And through new privacy anxieties, the processes and ethics of oral history must change to ensure the protection and confidentiality of participants. Although this presentation has discussed the role of these technologies and concerns in regards to history, many of these affect other disciplines, particularly those which work with the public and people. Academia, in the new age of digitization, needs to consider the ways in which research will continue to be ethical, safe, and how it will be interpreted. As research into and using the digital humanities becomes increasingly popular, we need new methodologies and frameworks. In short, this presentation has covered a broad scope of topics to discuss the future of oral history interviewing in the present day and using the Cold War as a historical case study, and considers how this methodology may change in the coming years. Thanks.